USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Learn more and get a quote at usaa.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. Last week, I was at Harvard University with the great Naomi Oreskes and a whole cast of other really fascinating researchers who are all looking at this question of climate accountability, and not just for the fossil fuel industry, but really, how do we widen the lens of accountability? How do we look at the industries that have enabled the fossil fuel industry to greenwash, for example? Where is the responsibility of the PR and advertising industries in that? Also, what are the other industries that have worked in lockstep with the fossil fuel industry to obstruct climate policy? So the automotive industry, the manufacturing industry, the airline industry, the list goes on and on. In this episode, I'm going to bring you some of the conversations from that event, starting with an interview with Naomi Oreskes about her work in general and also the work that has fed into her new book coming out in February. It's called The Big Myth, and it looks at where this idea that Americans should stop relying on or even trusting the government and instead rely on big business and the so-called free market came from. Where did this ideology come from and who does it benefit? It's a fascinating read. It's not out yet. I got an early copy and it's really, really, really good. So we got Naomi talking about some of the themes that come up in that book and some of the interesting research that fed into it. Then following that interview, we also had a panel discussion with 4 really interesting researchers. Dr. David Michaels, an epidemiologist and professor at George Washington University. He served as Assistant Secretary of Labor for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that's OSHA, from 2009 to 2017. He was the longest serving administrator in the agency's history. He's also written 2 books about doubt and deception in science. One is called Doubt is Their Product, and the other is The Triumph of Doubt. We also had Dr. Jennifer Jacquet. She's an associate professor of environmental studies at New York University, and she wrote a book called The Playbook: How to Deny Science, Sell Lies, and Make a Killing in the Corporate World. It's fantastic. We also talked with Jessica Wentz, a senior fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia, and Dr. Jeffrey Supran, who's a researcher at Harvard who's been working with Dr. Oreskes for a long time. He's about to start a really interesting new project at Miami University, specifically looking at how digital and social media plays into climate delay and denial. Those are both coming up right after this quick break.
The Abercrombie Kids Summer Sale is in full swing, with up to 50% off select styles for the season. Summer plans, vacation, and camp days are all covered, with new dresses, shorts, tees, and swim. Abercrombie Kids has the summer staples they need and the looks that they want to wear. Shop in-store, online, or in the app. Offer applies to select styles as indicated. Discount applied at checkout online.
Here at the Almond Joy Factory, where tropical vibes abound, we use soft, fresh-tasting coconut.
The crunchiest almonds and delicious chocolate candy.
Ah, but do you know what our most important ingredient is? Sometimes you feel like a nut.
Sometimes you don't.
Almond Joy's got nuts and something even way better than that. Yes, Almond Joy is made with almonds and joy.
My name is Naomi Oreskes. I'm the Henry Charles Lea Professor of the History of Science and Affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences here at Harvard University. So I'm going to start now by inviting my good friend and colleague, Amy Westervelt, to come up. And Amy and I are going to have a conversation for a little bit of time, and then we'll take a break. And then just so you know what the run of show is, after the break, we'll invite 4 more colleagues up to the stage to talk about their research in this important area. So, Amy, I was going to hand over the microphone to you, but you already have your own. So, metaphorically, I hand over the microphone.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Naomi, in your book, Emergence Doubt, you laid out some of this kind of network of enablers. And now we're talking about kind of widening the lens of accountability. Where do you think that lens needs to be widened, and how do we do that? What do we need to do that?
Well, one of the things, thanks for that question. One of the things we know from our research is that the fossil fuel industry doesn't work alone. And they probably couldn't be as successful as they are if they did, because they have expertise in one particular thing, finding fossil fuels and getting them out of the ground. But the fossil fuel industries themselves don't have expertise in advertising, marketing, public relations. And so they rely on a cadre of other industries that help and support them, that help them craft their messages. And they also rely on a network of think tanks that try to make it seem as if they're standing up for virtuous things like American freedom or prosperity, when in reality, what they're really doing is selling an incredibly dangerous and damaging product.
Right. And what are the kinds of things that are needed to go after those folks too? What kind of research is needed? What kind of thinking is needed to kind of, I don't know, build the kind of evidence that we have about the fossil fuel industry against these other industries?
Well, in this era we live in of disinformation, where we're saturated by disinformation, by half-truths, and sometimes by outright lies. Sometimes people throw up their hands and they say facts don't matter. But that's not true. What I like to say is that facts are not enough. Facts are a necessary but not sufficient condition for people to understand what's going on around them. But a lot of this work does start with the factual information, knowing the facts about who did what, when they did it, how they did it, why they did it. And so a lot of my work and the work I've done with Jeffrey Supran and Ben Franta and others is really to lay out those facts, to tell the story of what has happened so that we can really understand what has transpired and so that we can hold the industry accountable.
Can you talk a little bit? This is, bringing together lots of researchers from different realms. It's kind of encouraging collaboration, information sharing. Can you talk about how that's necessary, both from an information perspective, but also from a structural perspective? That to combat extractive industry, you should maybe be collaborative and not extractive yourself.
Yes, that's a great question. Well, I think there's 2 things. I mean, from a purely practical standpoint, we know that this network of deception and disinformation is huge. Some of our colleagues have tried to count them. I often, have joked that when I tried to make a slide with all the think tanks that had spread disinformation about climate change, I couldn't get it on one slide in a readable font. And if we include the PR companies, the advertising agencies, we've identified literally thousands. I think some of our colleagues have suggested as many as 8,000 different organizations that have been involved in this project. So this is huge. This is more than any one scholar could study and understand on their own. So it's really important that we have a collaborative effort so that each of us can take a piece of it, maybe the PR piece like Melissa Ronsick has worked on, or, the advertising piece, or the think tanks that I and Justin Farrell and Bob Brule and some others, or the funding streams. Bob Brule has done a lot of work on the funding streams. So by putting these pieces together, we can get a picture of what the whole looks like and how it functions. What are the sources of disinformation? Who's replicating it, reproducing it, who's crafting the narratives, all of that. And then I think it's also important to be collaborative, because just from a practical standpoint, if you try to do this work by yourself, it's too depressing. I mean, this is really hard work to do, because you're confronting really terrible things. You're confronting people and organizations who don't seem to care who gets hurt. who don't seem to have any respect for truth or honesty. Basic values and virtues that our parents taught us to respect and honor are routinely dishonored in this space. And so it's difficult work to deal with. And sometimes it's hard to even understand how people can behave this way. And so it's really important to have the moral support of your colleagues. And also because I think all of us who have worked in this space have had moments where we think, you know, is it me? Like, am I exaggerating this? Am I reading too much into this? You know, and then having colleagues saying, no, actually, it's not only is it as bad as you think, it's actually worse. And then they show you the evidence and you realize you are reading this correctly. You're not exaggerating. You're not misinterpreting. Having that objective and honest feedback from colleagues, it's crucial in all academic work, but it's particularly crucial in this space.
Yeah. I know that this comes up for any academic, especially any academics that do work that the fossil fuel industry doesn't particularly like. Accusations of bias, or you're an activist, or these kinds of things. How do you deal with that? And I guess what's your response to that sort of framing?
Well, my first response is that if they're attacking us, we must be doing something right. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you think about it, ExxonMobil is this multi-billion-dollar corporation with armies of well-paid lawyers, strategists, expensive advertising and PR firms that work for them. And if we get under their skin, if they feel that they need to undermine what we are achieving, that's kind of suggesting that we're onto something. And so I always take it as a reminder that, if someone's trying to shut you up, it probably means you have something to say. And also that, they're worried, right? I think they're worried because they know that they have done something wrong. They know they're selling a dangerous and deadly product. They know that they have worked for 30 years to stop meaningful action to transition to a safer, greener, renewable energy economy. They know they've lobbied Congress. And I think they know, this is my opinion, but I think that they know that they've lied. And so they know that there's a risk that they will be held accountable culturally, socially, politically, and possibly legally. And I think they're scared. And we know that when people are scared, they often, do kind of desperate things. So, we get attacked all the time. I try to, take it as fuel.
Okay, you have a new book coming out in February, and it looks at the history of this idea of so-called free market capitalism and how it got so ingrained in American culture to think about the idea of trade-offs between the economy and the environment, or between the economy and, public health and social well-being. And also this idea of it's better to rely on corporations than the government. Can you just talk a little bit about what prompted you to dig into that history?
Sure. Well, when Eric Conway and I were writing Merchants of Doubt, one of the things we found was that there was this consistent pattern in the rhetoric of the fossil fuel industry and their allies, particularly their ideological allies in libertarian think tanks like the George C. Marshall Institute, in which they would say that they were protecting freedom, and that environmentalists like you and I, that we wanted to take away people's freedom. Now, I thought that was completely ridiculous. In fact, I thought it was sort of absurd because actually, if anything threatens our freedom, it's climate change. I mean, look at the people in Florida who are displaced now, who've lost their homes. I mean, they're not free, right? Yeah. So, and then we discovered that they had taken that trope from the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry had used the trope of freedom to try to prevent government regulation of its deadly products. And to say, well, if you let the government regulate tobacco, it's only a matter of time before we're living under a Soviet dictatorship. It was such a ridiculous argument, and it was so clearly, patently, fallacious, and refuted by so much evidence from history, that we started wondering, well, where did this argument come from? Mm-hmm. And similarly, as you just suggested, they also put forward this dichotomy that, sadly, many of us have bought into, this idea that we have to choose between the economy and the environment. But I knew enough about the history of environmental regulation and environmental activism to know that actually many environmental regulations have helped the economy. They've generated jobs. We have a line towards the end of Merchants of Doubt where we say, we all know that necessity is the mother of invention, regulation is a very powerful form of necessity. And we saw this in the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990 that were designed to deal with acid rain, that when those amendments were put in place, those regulations, companies came up with good technological innovations to improve the efficiency of their power plants. So we knew that argument about environment versus economy was false, and yet so many people believed it. So we wanted to know where that came from. So it took a while. All important things take time. But now Eric Conway and I have finished the new book that tries to answer that question. Where did this idea that we can, that if we regulate the economy, we're on the road to communism, where did that come from? Who promoted it? Who promoted the idea that we have to choose between the economy and the environment? And who proposed the idea that regulation is somehow a threat, when in fact it's one of our most powerful tools to protect ourselves? And so the new book is called The Big Myth: How American Business Taught Us to Loathe the Government and Love the Free Market.
Just as you're talking, it makes me think of, I feel like in all of these situations, the free speech arguments, for example, or this, they often are saying, no, you guys don't want this. When in reality, it's corporations that don't want regulation, right? So this idea that regulation is bad for us as individuals.
Right. Well, there's a huge amount of projection in this space.
Yeah.
Ben Santer, one of the first climate scientists who was really horribly attacked by the fossil fuel industry and its allies, one time said to me he couldn't understand all the things they were accusing him of doing until he realized that's what they were doing, cherry picking the data, misrepresenting the science, telling half-truths,
Yeah.
So that's something that's really important to keep in mind. When you hear them say, Oreskes is trying to take away my free speech rights, you should get very worried that actually they're trying to take away your free speech rights.
Yeah.
And we've seen this particularly in the big ag business with these I forget what it's called, but these laws that they're like product defamation laws that you can't say bad things about meat.
Yeah.
I mean, this is shocking, right? How is that even possibly legal for corporate America to prevent Americans from speaking freely about what they think about red meat? And yet we have seen laws like that pass in the state. So actually, in many cases, it's actually big industry that is trying to suppress free speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they're trying to expand it for themselves and limit it for us, right?
Exactly. And of course, as I always like to say, free speech isn't free. It's very expensive. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on these advertising campaigns, these PR campaigns, these greenwashing ads. It's not an all a level playing field. They have far more money to put out their message than, for example, I do. And one of the things we look at in the book, in the new book, is how much money was spent actually on pushing out their ad campaigns. And it's probably, we've been able to document specific campaigns that spend hundreds of millions of dollars on just one piece of the story. So we're looking at billions and billions of dollars that have been spent to promote the story of American industry, the story of the so-called free market, the anti-regulatory, anti-government story, while us academics, most of us, we have budgets for our science, if we're lucky, in the tens to hundreds of thousands, and often there's no money in it for a communication component. So if we want to communicate our results, that's something we have to do on our spare time or on our own dime.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the, I don't want you to spoil the book for people.
Spoiler, that's okay. Spoiler, it's 500 pages. There's no way I could describe it all here.
Yeah. Can you share just some of the things that that were maybe some of the more surprising findings as you started to look into this? Like what jumped out at you as something, I don't know, those moments when you find something and you're like, oh, this is big. What was it?
Well, I think one of the things that keeps surprising me repeatedly is how the same people, the same actors, the same institutes keep cropping up over and over and over again. So one of them is the National Association of Manufacturers. This is a trade group that represents manufacturing industry in America. And I should start by saying, I like manufacturing. I'm in favor of manufacturing jobs. Someone manufactured my shoes and this microphone. So I'm not anti-manufacturing, but NAM is anti-climate science. And they have been involved in numerous amicus briefs on court cases trying to stop policy action on climate change. They have partnered with organizations that have spread disinformation about climate science. And they were one of the original members of the Global Climate Coalition, which in the 1990s worked actively, consciously, and by their own admission, to stop the United States from ratifying the Kyoto Protocol to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is a group that has been extremely active in the anti-climate science space. In the new book, we track them all the way back to arguments over child labor in the early part of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Now, you might say today, who in the world would defend child labor? Who in the world would think that it was fine for a 5-year-old to work in a textile mill up the road in Lowell, Massachusetts? And the answer is, in the early 20th century, the National Association of Manufacturers thought that, and not just thought that, but actively lobbied against child labor bills.
Wow. And I feel like they're also one of the few organizations that has never stopped denying climate science, right? Like they never really...
So far as I know, I mean, if they've ever made a public statement acknowledging that climate change is real and caused by people, accepting the science, I'm not aware of that. Mm-hmm. If they would do that, I would be very happy to tweet it.
Can you talk a little bit about, the sort of acceleration of all of this free market stuff post-World War II? What was going on, and, why did we see such an explosion of it?
Yeah, so one of the big questions that comes up often, is, am I against capitalism, or is this book a manifesto against capitalism? And the answer to that is no, because one of the interesting things we see in this story is that, well, capitalism has been around for, since at least we can say the early 18th century, and it's evolved and changed a lot during that time. So the capitalism of Adam Smith is not the capitalism of global finance that we have today. And so one of the things we were interested in our book is how certain kinds of arguments came to the fore really only since about the 1970s onward. Often people will mark the administration of Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, Ronald Reagan here in the United States, as kind of a turning point where a set of ideas that until then had been considered pretty not mainstream, pretty outlier ideas, that we could just trust markets to solve our problems. We didn't need the government to remedy market failure. In the 1930s, very few people thought that was a credible argument. John Maynard Keynes famously said, laissez-faire is dead. I mean, nobody thought during the Great Depression, I shouldn't say nobody, there were people who thought that, but very few people could stand up in the depths of the Great Depression and say, oh, it's all fine, just leave it all to the magic of the marketplace. I mean, Herbert Hoover tried to say that, and we know what happened to him. So, right, he lost his bid for re-election.
Yeah.
So that idea, the idea that somehow markets would solve all our problems, that was really discredited after the Great Depression. But there was a group of thinkers financed by American business, and we document this in the new book, who worked really hard to resurrect laissez-faire economics. They didn't call it that. They gave it a new name. They called it a few different things. Sometimes they didn't call it anything. Sometimes they just called it Americanism or the American way of life. Patriotism, right. So they put a lot of nice sounding language on it, but most people know it as neoliberalism, right? The idea that the economy will thrive and do best if the government just steps back, lets the markets do their magic, and that any government attempt to regulate or control the market is a distortion, right? And we've all heard those arguments. So a lot of work was put into making people think that those arguments were right. And in the book, we document how a group of American businessmen associated with the DuPont Corporation, associated with the Libertarian Lunau Fund, actively worked to identify and fund academics who would then promote these ideas to give them academic credibility. And not all of those academics, but most of them were at the University of Chicago. And so they consciously helped to build the Chicago School of Economics. So we call this a kind of unnatural selection. They chose people who had views that they liked, they fostered them, they fed them, literally and metaphorically, and they promoted them so that these ideas then got picked up by journalists, got picked up by politicians, and especially got picked up by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and then implemented in US and UK policy.
I think a lot of people in this room can probably connect the dots from there to what we see in climate, but can you just sort of lay that out for people? Like, how does that lay the groundwork for what we see in climate obstruction today?
Sure. Well, so the first administration where we begin to see science denial is the administration of Ronald Reagan. Prior to that, Republican presidents, you might have agreed or disagreed with their policies or their worldviews, but they didn't deny science. Dwight Eisenhower was a great fan and supporter of science. He had a very strong science advisory committee. Richard Nixon, not so much. We know Nixon didn't really like scientists. In fact, We know he hated scientists, but nevertheless, he didn't deny scientific evidence. But that changes and neither did Gerald Ford. It changes with the administration of Ronald Reagan. There we begin to see for the first time the rejection of scientific evidence. And what evidence? Not all science. Reagan was perfectly fine with biomedicine. But evidence, scientific evidence that pointed to the need for regulation of markets, regulation of air pollution, regulation of water pollution. And the big issue during the Reagan administration was acid rain, and then the emerging problems around the ozone hole, but also the evidence of climate change was starting to emerge at this time. The Reagan administration began to align the Republican Party with climate change denial. That if there was science that showed there's a market failure, this product, this legal product is killing people, that was a problem for their ideology. Because their ideology, and Reagan was the one who put into the lexicon the notion of the magic of the marketplace. So the ideology was government should get out of the way. Reagan famously said in his inaugural address, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. So the ideology is government is bad, markets are good, so government needs to step back, let the private sector sort these things out. But now you have scientists saying, well, wait, hold on a second. Private sector activity, whether it's tobacco or it's air pollution from power plants and automobiles, are causing these big problems. They're hurting people, they're causing sickness and death, they're damaging property. I mean, acid rain did a lot of property damage, hurting the environment, killing fish. So that science was a problem for their ideology. And so what we see is that Reagan-oriented Republicans begin to deny the science. And at first it's a little bit. We see in Emergence of Doubt, we documented some interference with an important report on acid rain. But then it really begins to accelerate. So that by the time we get to the 1990s, when the scientific evidence of global warming has become overwhelming, and we have a scientific consensus, and we even have a political consensus under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Republican Party turns against it.
That's so interesting. Where would you personally like to see more research done on climate accountability in general? Or, is there any like golden goose document that you wish you could, get your hands on?
Well, one thing that's come up in our research discussions has to do with demonstrating the impact of disinformation, denial, deceit, all those good D words, and one important G word, greenwashing. So we know this has all taken place. We've documented it chapter and verse. What's harder to know is what the impact of it is. It's relatively easy. I don't want to say easy because my work is hard, but relatively easy to go to an archive, find documents, see what the document shows, see what people have done, and even to know why they did it. Often the documents will explain the motivation, the strategy. And so we know, and we showed this Emergence of Doubt, that a lot of the early climate change denial was motivated by these pro-market, what we call market fundamentalist ideologies. But proving the effect it had, what did a person, if I'm at home in my house and I see a greenwashing ad on television, what effect does that have on me? Or in one of my earlier papers, I documented an ad campaign that had been run by a group called the Information Council on the Environment. And this is something that many of us have found. These things, names that sound very nice. Oh, Information Council on the Environment sounds like an environmental group, and it sounds like they're giving us information. No, it was a disinformation group wholly funded by coal producers in the Powder River Basin in the western United States. And its aim was to confuse people about the climate science so that they would not support action. And we know that was the aim because we have the documents where they say that in their own words in black and white. So we know why they did it. What we don't really know is what the impact was. Now, in this case, we know they think it was successful because there are actually some memos where they boast about their successes. So one of the successes they boast about is how they got editors to then write articles that would support the ad campaign, reiterate the message that the science was unsettled. But it's harder. It's much harder to know what the effect is. And also, we know we've had 30 years of inaction on climate change, and we know that. But how do these different pieces fit together? How much of this can we pin on the disinformation from the fossil fuel industry versus other factors like, other industries that have been involved? It's not just fossil fuels. So we need more research on that. We need more research that shows the ways in which disinformation influences people's thinking about problems and therefore influences what they will or won't do, either in terms of supporting policy action or buying an electric car or, replacing their windows with better windows or whatever it is.
Yeah. Excuse me. I'm curious what you think about, I guess, what the solution to disinformation is, right? Like there's this sense of, we need some kind of regulation. But every time you talk about that, people are like, but that's an infringement on free speech. So how do you regulate disinformation in a way that doesn't get people's, free speech hackles up?
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question. And again, this is an area we need more research, but we do know some things. So first of all, one thing that I remind people of is that what Judge Kessler said in the big tobacco case, which is that the First Amendment does not protect fraud. Fraud is a crime. You do not have a right to commit crimes. So if by saying something you are committing fraud, that is not protected by the First Amendment, and judges have said so. So I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind and not to be sort of, sucked into kind of agreeing that it's a problem to try to call out fraud.
Yeah.
No, fraud is a crime, period.
Yeah.
Breathe on that. Okay. But in addition, one of the things that that I've seen in my own work and that other people have worked on, particularly John Cook has done some very nice work on this, is the idea of inoculation. Is that if you can show people, if you can explain to people, this is disinformation. This is part of a greenwashing campaign. This is a deliberate attempt to prevent Congress from acting on climate change by undermining public support for environmental policy. If you explain that to people, that can be very, very effective. And we talked about this in the film version of Merchants of Doubt. In a way, the whole climate deception game is a con game. It's a lie. It's like three-card Monte. Nobody wants to be on the losing end of a con. No one wants to be the sucker that is suckered by all of this. And so when you put it that way and say, do you really want to be conned by the fossil fuel industry? Do you want to be conned into continuing to buy a product that is actually going to bring actual material harm to your home? I mean, now is not the time to talk to people in Florida about that, but soon, right? Or we can be talking about it. I mean, obviously those people need help in this moment.
Yeah.
But people need to understand, the American people need to understand that hurricane was made worse by climate change. And of course, even as we speak, the forces of disinformation are already out there trying to intimidate scientists. Oh, you can't say that, blah, blah, blah. No, you can say that because we know, first of all, that there is more heat in the atmosphere. There's more heat in the ocean. Ocean heat drives hurricanes. When you have more heat in the Gulf of Mexico, you will get more hurricane activity, either more hurricanes or stronger hurricanes. That's science. We know that. This particular hurricane, well, fortunately, scientists have got a lot better in doing rapid, what they call detection and attribution studies. And already this morning, we have a study that says that we can say with confidence that the storm was at least 10% worse than it would have been. And 10% is a lot when it comes to infrastructure. Because again, this is something that maybe some people don't always get right away. 10% might not sound like a lot. If I have $10 and then you give me one more, I have 11, not bad. Rather have 11 than 10, but it doesn't change my life.
Yeah.
But infrastructure is generally designed to cope with a range of conditions. And the range of conditions that we expect to deal with is based on past experience. When our experience begins to change, scientists have a technical term for this. They call it non-stationarity. Every now and again, I like to throw in the geek stuff, but it's actually a very important concept. Stationarity implies that we can assume that the future will be like the past, and therefore the data we have from the past will be relevant in predicting the future. That is no longer true. There was a really important paper written some years ago called Stationarity is Dead. So that's actually a great slogan, even though it's a little geeky, right?
Yeah.
Because it means that our infrastructure, which has been designed to deal with a range of conditions based on past experience, is no longer able to cope with what we were experiencing. And we saw that in spades in Florida. And we've seen it in the wildfires in the West. Yeah. We've seen it in so many different ways. So that extra 10% could be the difference between a bridge being stable and a bridge being washed out.
That's it for our interview with Dr. Oreskes. We're going to take a quick ad break now and be back with the panel featuring Dr. David Michaels, Dr. Jennifer Jacquet, Jessica Wintz, and Dr. Jeffrey Supran.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Supran. I'm a research associate here at Harvard and co-host of this meeting with Naomi Oreskes. I wanted to start by taking us back to 2015, when journalists at Inside Climate News and the LA Times published really groundbreaking work uncovering internal documents suggesting that Exxon has known about the basics of climate science for decades. ExxonMobil, of course, said any such allegations of wrongdoing were false, and they challenged the public to, quote, read the documents. They said, read all of these documents and make up your own mind. So Naomi and I decided to take them up on that challenge. And over the course of a year, we read the documents and we analyzed them according to social science methods. And what resulted was the first ever peer-reviewed academic analysis of ExxonMobil's 40-year history of climate change communications. And what we discovered were systematic discrepancies between, on the one hand, what the company said, what their scientists said about climate change privately and in academic circles, versus, on the other, what they said to the general public in the New York Times and elsewhere. And so, in other words, our analysis showed that ExxonMobil misled the public about the basics of climate science and its implications. And they did so effectively by contributing quietly to the science, but loudly to promoting doubt about that science. So this combination of journalistic and scholarly approaches really seemed to awaken maybe something a little new in the public consciousness about the climate crisis. Inside Climate News was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize, and our own article was read hundreds of millions of times. You know, CNN used it when questioning Joe Biden about this stuff. And our work, of course, was just one example of a really growing wave of journalism and scholarship that has been nurtured by a small group of really dedicated people, many in this room, for several decades, but which has exploded over the past few years. So today there are literally hundreds of scholars, journalists, and nonprofit researchers in 30-plus countries, laser-focused on climate disinformation, drawing on interdisciplinary techniques as diverse as the history of science, sociology, geography, communication science, computational linguistics, and journalism, of course. And collectively, we have learned so much. At its most fundamental level, this research has shown that the climate crisis isn't just a problem about the pollution of our atmosphere. It's also about a pollution of our information landscape by arguably the dirtiest technology ever invented, which is the climate denial and delay machine. So this is a well-funded, well-oiled labyrinth of people and money connecting fossil fuel interests, think tanks, foundations, PR firms, and front groups, and all feeding into an echo chamber of astroturfs, media, blogs, and politicians. And in today's time, I really want to focus on big fossil. So that's the coal, oil, gas, utility companies that represent core cogs, but certainly not the only ones in this denial and delay machine. And time and again, what research by me and my colleagues has shown is that big fossil is the new big tobacco. So what I mean by that is that big fossil, big tobacco, actually most industries that produce harmful or deadly products tend to follow the same four-step playbook. First, they know. Then they scheme, then they deny the science, and then they delay action with other forms of propaganda. And what I'd like to do is to walk you through some of the past and present of those four steps. So step one in their playbook is to learn about the dangers of their products. Simply put, the fossil fuel industry has known that its products could cause dangerous global warming since the 1950s, for more than 50 years. By 1959, more than 60 years ago, twice my lifetime, the American Petroleum Institute knew that burning fossil fuels could lead to global warming, quote, sufficient to melt the ice cap and submerge New York. Their knowledge continued to grow, and through the 70s and 80s, scientists at Exxon and elsewhere did really cutting-edge climate research, warning their executives of potentially catastrophic climate impacts. And the coal industry has likewise known about the basics of climate science since the 60s, electric utilities, GM, Ford, and Total since at least the 70s, and Shell at least since the 80s. But instead of alerting the public or taking action, what they did was stay silent for as long as they possibly could, until what Exxon internally called a critical event in 1988, when NASA's chief climate scientist warned Congress that he was now 99% confident that human-caused global warming was underway. 1988. It was the year that action was supposed to begin. It was the year that policymakers began to take note. It was the year that it hit the headlines. It was the year that Time magazine called Earth its planet of the year. But for that very reason, instead, 1988 became the moment that step two kicked in and Big Fossil schemed, devising a PR strategy straight out of Big Tobacco's playbook to weaponize science against itself. So in 1988, Exxon set out to, quote, extend the science, to, quote, emphasize the uncertainty, or as a 1998 oil industry memo put it, victory will be achieved when average citizens and the media recognize uncertainties in climate science. So these plans put into motion steps 3 and 4 to deny the science and delay action with propaganda. And from that point forward, in the late 80s, and to this day, oil and gas companies and the PR firms that abet them have waged a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar campaign of lobbying, disinformation, and propaganda to sabotage science, to slander scientists, to confuse the public, and ultimately to undermine policy to protect profits. So in terms of lobbying, between 2000 and 2016, fossil fuel interests spent $2 billion lobbying Congress against climate legislation. They outspent environmentalists by 10 to 1. And as of the late 2010s, climate-denying members of Congress received 4 times as much money from the fossil fuel industry as those who accept basic science. In terms of disinformation, much of the fossil fuel industry spent the better part of 2 decades explicitly denying the basics of climate science. And they did so both, as Naomi said, directly, but also by paying contrarian scientists, politicians, and think tanks and so on who did it for them. And there's basically way too much history to unpack here, but the picture I want you to have in mind is, for instance, the coal and utility group that Naomi mentioned, running newspaper ads in 1991, claiming, quote, non-existent proof of global warming. It's a 1997 ad campaign by a front group for utilities, coal, railroad, auto, etc., attacking the UN Kyoto Climate Protocol, as we were discussing, through economic scaremongering. It's the New York Times editorials by Mobil and ExxonMobil, one of the largest marketing campaigns in American history, that called climate science a lie they tell our children in the 1980s and as confusing as a maze in the 2000s. And finally, it's Senator Jim Inhofe taking $2 million from oil and gas companies while at the same time describing global warming as the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. All told, climate denial by fossil fuel interests, as we've been discussing at this meeting, has set back climate action by 2 to 3 decades. And it's really turned what was a serious challenge into the greatest emergency in human history. Over the past decade, however, as the public and policymakers have woken up, the industry's propaganda has necessarily evolved from the outright blatant denial of the past to various forms of propaganda that we call discourses of delay. So one of Big Fossil's most prominent and notorious discourses has been greenwashing, which is when a company talks green but acts dirty. So in 2020, for instance, Chevron put out 65 TV ads a day. Others found that roughly 80% of those ads contain green sustainability messaging. And that's compared to the 0.2% of their budget that they actually invest in low-carbon technologies. More subtle but equally insidious is the discourses of individualized responsibility. As most of you here know, the very notion of a personal carbon footprint was first popularized by none other than BP. And a third common discourse of delay is fossil fuel solutionism, whereby big oil asserts that fossil fuels will be essential for the foreseeable future. And since at least the 80s, fossil fuel companies have been calling methane clean, and since 2006, BP has been touting an all-of-the-above energy mantra. And unfortunately, these rhetorics were adopted by the Obama administration, when in reality, no major fossil fuel company anywhere in the world has a plan consistent with the Paris Agreement. The last thing I want to say is that not only has Big Fossil's messaging evolved, so too has their medium. So today, climate deception really has gone digital. And then, really social media in particular has become the new frontier of propaganda. In the run-up to the last US presidential election, ExxonMobil spent more on advertising on Facebook and Instagram than any other company in the world except for Facebook itself. All told, even as Big Fossil's climate propaganda has evolved, their end goal remains the same, and that's to stop action on the climate crisis. But what has changed has been the uprising and efforts to confront this and hold them accountable for this behavior. Since 2015, almost 24 American cities, states, and counties have sued fossil fuel companies and trade associations for their climate damages, denial, and deception. And there have been first of their kind hearings in Congress, in the EU, and elsewhere. And there have been international documentaries bringing this stuff to light. But most importantly, there's also been a powerful grassroots and shareholder movement emerging under this moniker of Exxon New. And the bedrock of all these accountability efforts, in fact, the only reason we know everything that I'm saying right now is because of the work of the researchers, the journalists, the advocates in this room and beyond. From sleuthing in archives to peer-reviewed research, to journalism, to expert witness testimony, to amicus briefs, this community is the driving force for global climate accountability. And now more than ever, as our planet warms up, as humanity's carbon budget shrinks, as big fossils lobbying and propaganda become more subtle and systematic, and as accountability efforts mount to meet them, there is an urgent need for solutions-oriented research to expose the industries of climate deception. And in response to this moment, of course, we've been meeting here today in Harvard, and in response to this moment, I think we're seeing a generational shift in research and journalism in this field. So we're basically seeing a growing movement of truly engaged scholars unwilling to accept the traditional mores of academia that say that advocacy and academia are oxymorons. A new class of interdisciplinary researchers drawing on a truly unprecedented range of techniques and seeking out rather than shying away from impact-driven collaborations with all the advocates and practitioners in this room. I'd finish by saying that as climate scientist Jacquet said a few years ago, we need to shift the academic mantra away from publish, publish, publish to publish, communicate, engage. And I think that this meeting here today shows that we're making brilliant progress. And so my call to action is for us to keep going. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand over to my friend and colleague, Professor David Michaels.
Thank you, Jeffrey. My name is David Michaels. I'm an epidemiologist at the George Washington University School of Public Health. I served as the Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA. I ran OSHA for almost 8 years under President Obama. And I've written a couple of books on disinformation, and I'm here to talk about disinformation and the enablers of climate change and the acceptance of toxicity of chemicals and the scientists who do that. So I have a couple of slides here that I'm going to share. The basic premise of my talk is that it has become standard operating procedure when a company, when a corporation faces allegations that their product is causing illness or despoiling the environment, isn't to say, let's figure out what the problem is. Maybe if they were Patagonia, they're doing that. But otherwise, they say, how can we take this on? How can we essentially manufacture uncertainty so we can continue to do what we're doing and avoid regulation by a government agency or avoid liability related to litigation from people who've been hurt? We often call this the tobacco playbook because tobacco did so well for so long and killed so many people. And we call it that also because the tobacco documents that are available allow us to document exactly what they did. That really predates tobacco, and it was done by the lead industry, by the sugar industry, by the asbestos industry. But we know what tobacco did. And there is, of course, the wonderful quote from the tobacco library that said, "Doubt is our product." Not tobacco, but doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It's the means of establishing controversy. Of course, if there's controversy among science, some scientists say this, some scientists say the opposite, then the instinct of the public is to say, well, we just got to do more research. We shouldn't do anything until we really figure out the answer. Of course, that's exactly what the playbook is, to delay. The tobacco industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars sending out information essentially to point at other causes of lung cancer other than tobacco. My favorite, of course, is lung cancer rare in bald men. But you could go through there, you could find endless amounts of things in there, in those library documents. But what happened was a lot of the same scientists who worked for tobacco then moved on. They saw that there's a very lucrative business to be made creating uncertainty. And I call this the Enronization of science. Those of you who remember the Enron Corporation, it's a house of cards. It was a giant fraud that ended up, when it collapsed, after some people made a huge amount of money, many people, many pensioners lost all of their savings. They lost their pensions because this was a company that really wasn't, it was fake. And what this science is very similar to what Enron was doing. Scientists are hired, or their firms are hired, essentially to defend products. And that's the model, to defend a product. They call themselves product defense. The studies they do have no important scientific value. They really have no scientific value. They're there for use in regulation and litigation. No one cares about these studies. They're done for these purposes, to use in litigation. You would never cite one of these studies because they're not of any interest to anybody. In terms of how they market, it's really interesting. The key thing is to think about this idea of the loss of presumptive innocence. Many of us who, we watch all the TV shows about lawyers, and there are even some lawyers in the room, the idea that in the United States, if a person's accused of a crime, they're innocent until proven guilty. And so the chemical companies and the fossil fuel companies and others have essentially taken this idea and inserted it into this discussion, not overtly, so you don't see it, but this idea is until we prove something's guilty, it's innocent. But chemicals shouldn't be like that. It should be the opposite. We shouldn't be exposed to something unless we know it's safe. But that's been turned upside down, and the product defense people know that, and that's exactly how they structure their arguments to show that we haven't proven it's dangerous, and therefore we can continue to use it. And that turns out to be a terrible mistake, and many people pay for that with their health and their lives. A couple of examples. I'll go through them pretty quickly. When diesel fuel is burned, from engines, it puts out particulates and a whole bunch of other very nasty materials. We've thought for a long time that these particulates are carcinogenic, but it's very difficult to study that in people because if you live near, say, a road, you're also exposed to a lot of other things. If you're a driver, you're exposed to other things. But a couple of government agencies realized that there are mines which use gigantic diesel engines, and the workers, the miners, are exposed to diesel engine exhaust, and the material in the mines otherwise don't cause cancer. So let's do some studies in the mines. The industry spent a tremendous amount of time fighting those studies, trying to stop them from being done. But eventually, when they were done, there were two studies done by the National Cancer Institute, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. To everybody's shock, I'm saying ironically, it turns out diesel engine exhaust increases your risk of lung cancer. So how did the industry respond? Not by saying, let's make a clean diesel product, though a few companies, Cummins, for example, said, let's make a clean diesel product. Most did not. What they did was they hired scientists to say, well, those studies are bad. And they really ran a disinformation campaign. They do something called strategic literature reviews. You get some scientists together, they read the literature and say, no, we don't agree. It doesn't say that. It says, the literature really doesn't say it's carcinogenic. They did this study and another one, and another study. Eventually, they got the raw data and they reanalyzed it. If you give me the raw data from a study, I can change the parameters around and turn a positive study negative. It's epidemiological alchemy. It's all doable. And they did it over and over again. A lot of this was done by a firm called Gradient, which is just down the road here in Cambridge. And that's what they specialize in. And it goes on and on. This was done by a company called Exponent. Another example, PFAS, which is in the news quite a bit. Many of you have seen the movie Dark Waters, which actually goes through some of these studies. And it's really sort of an ugly history. When community residents in the area of this DuPont plant in West Virginia on the border of Ohio started saying there were some serious issues with their water contamination. DuPont recommended West Virginia hire this one consulting firm, Terra, which is run by Michael Dorson. You may remember he was a candidate to be the assistant administrator of EPA for chemicals, but actually Republican senators stopped that because they knew of his work on PFAS in Gen X, North Carolina. So they said, you cannot use him. So his nomination was withdrawn. But he did a study. Hold on. Wait a minute. There. He said, West Virginia, the safe level of this particular PFAS in the water there is 150 parts per billion. Now, DuPont internally already was saying 1 part per billion is the safe level. But we're going to tell the folks around there that 150 parts is the safe level. Then DuPont, when things began to heat up, they hired this firm called ChemRisk, which is still around. And they, based on that first study, they said, don't worry, the exposures here, they estimated the exposures 10,000 times less than any exposure that could cause any illness. It's safe. Don't worry about it. Now, while that was going on, because of these lawsuits that were covered in Dark Waters, and Rob Billett, the lawyer, really managed to negotiate, DuPont actually had to pay for a bunch of epidemiologic studies done by scientists that they didn't choose. They were chosen jointly by their lawyers and the plaintiffs' lawyers. And those 3 world-famous epidemiologists did a series of studies, probably the best studies we'll ever have on that sort of chemicals in water, and found that PFAS increases your risk of several different diseases. Among workers, it was testicular and kidney cancer. There's some autoimmune conditions. that could have been going on. The studies all showed PFAS having particularly serious toxic effects. But when 3M and DuPont faced lawsuits, they hired Exponent in this case, which produced a literature review saying, the evidence doesn't support the hypothesis of a causal association between any of these chemicals and cancer. They could just dismiss those studies that actually DuPont paid for. The National Toxicology Program said, these are presumed, because of these human and animal studies, they're presumed to be immune hazards to humans. So Gradient, again, disagreed, and they filed papers with NTP saying the human and animal evidence does not support NTP's conclusions, and we should downrate the hazards. And finally, this was a big one for a case in Minnesota where the state of Minnesota sued 3M. They said, this is years later, PFAS contamination, essentially there is no health effect that's associated with PFAS contamination. Of course, you know what the numbers are. EPA recently essentially said there is no safe level, 0.004 parts per trillion. So who pays for this? I'll do this very briefly. Not just people who are sickened, but in fact, a lot of these corporations, the shareholders end up paying the price of this. You probably all heard that J&J has actually pulled baby powder from the market. They no longer sell talcum powder-based baby powder, talc-based baby powder from in the United States and Canada. They still sell it in India, of course, other places. The reason for that is there have been lawsuits following a lot of studies that showed a link between ovarian cancer and talc exposure. There was one case where 22 women sued. The total award to the women was $25 million each, but the jurors saw what J&J was saying in their internal documents, and so they, things like time to come up with more confusion. And they end up getting a $4 billion award. I'll just pass on this. It was cut in half, but they still had to pay more than $2 billion because the juror said, this is appalling. We want to send DuPont a message. J&J's market capitalization went down about $50 billion after that. They're facing 14,000 lawsuits, actually more now, and they had to pull baby powder from the market. And they now, you've probably heard about this, but they're trying to spin off a company directly into bankruptcy with all that liability to avoid having to pay out any more cases of women with ovarian cancer. Similar to glyphosate, was found to be a probable carcinogen by IARC. Monsanto launched a international campaign to essentially say that wasn't true, but to go after the scientists who did that work. This all was revealed in lawsuits. Monsanto has won a few lawsuits. They've lost a few lawsuits. The first case was $250 million and $1 billion case. They were all reduced, but Bayer is facing 20,000 cases. And what's interesting is Bayer, which purchased Monsanto for $63 billion, at the time, Bayer was worth $87 billion. That's been called one of the worst corporate deals ever. And, because Bayer is worth 53% of what it was worth before it borrowed all this money. So that's where we are. Very, very briefly here, how do we know these are product defense companies? How do we know what they're doing is not science? Go to Glassdoor, one worker said, this is a law consulting company, not a science consulting company. Don't expect to be a scientist if you work here. Or Gradient, some of the principal scientists have questionable ethics and been called out for it. Or sometimes you'll be seen working for evil doers and trying to make them seem like they did nothing wrong. The areas this would work in are outrageously wide. It also has a big impact on how people think about science. Because when you see sort of scientists who disagree, even though the disagreements aren't real, they're sort of based in these fraudulent studies, I think it hurts how people think about science and how people respond to science. So in shameless self-promotion, I've written a book on all this, actually a couple of books, but this book, The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money and the Science of Deception, comes out in paperback next week. And so you can read more about that. So thank you all so much. And I have the pleasure of turning over the microphone to Jennifer Jacquet, who has just written a terrific new book on that playbook. So, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was asked here today to speak about enablers of industry. And just like there are accountants, right, that help companies minimize their tax burden and move money offshore, there are a bunch of third parties to help these companies deal with scientific evidence. And we've heard numerous examples. And, occasionally these third parties are referred to as third-party allies. But I think that's a little like mistaking a sex worker for your girlfriend. The PR firms and law firms and even scientists who align themselves with industry would align themselves with another client with potentially opposite views if they offered bigger, longer-term contracts. I mean, this is work for hire. And that's not to downplay the role of things like think tanks that Professor Oreskes was mentioning, like the George C. Marshall Institute, which truly shares the fundamental ideology of the corporation, which is to postpone or prevent regulatory action. And I also don't want to downplay the role of trade associations who do so much of the dirty work for these companies, and they say things so the company doesn't have to. The Center for Consumer Freedom can call obesity a myth so that McDonald's can say that it's taking obesity seriously. And the Independent Petroleum Association of America can launch divestmentfacts.com so that Exxon can stay in the shadows of the divestment debate. The American Farm Bureau Federation said in 2019 that even if greenhouse gases are a factor in climate change, it's not clear if this is due to natural global climate cycles or other factors, such as greenhouse gases. So you see a direct denial, really, of the problem of anthropogenic climate change from a gigantic trade association of agriculture. But there is a special spot in the question of enablers for public relations, or strategic communications, or crisis management, or advertising firms, or whatever category you want to put around these groups. And these are firms where a lot of well-intentioned journalists go to die. Public relations are a big and expensive piece of the denial puzzle. And again, I think it's important to remember that they are work for hire. They fit very neatly into Harry Frankfurter, the philosopher's idea of bullshit, that the essence of bullshit is not that it is false, but that it is phony. So bullshit may be true or false. And that doesn't mean that bullshit isn't disinformation. That happens. And we know a huge mastermind behind disinformation is John Hill, who founded Hill and Knowlton. He came up with the whole idea of creating scientific controversy that David Michaels was just talking so much about. And he used that with the cigarette companies, obviously, to challenge the link between smoking and cancer. Hill and Knowlton, though, they did not seek any medical expertise. They didn't talk to scientists. That wasn't their interest. They were there to support their clients. And you see that language in PR all the time. We are here to support the client. But the main way in which I believe PR firms have been essential is in scaling the tactics across industries. So really the globalization of deceit and denial. Before he worked for cigarettes, John Hill worked for the Manufacturing Chemists Association and successfully prevented the government from mandating testing on the food supply for chemicals. And then he used the notion of scientific controversy both with cigarettes a few years later, and then he got the Johns Manville asbestos account in the 60s, and then in the 70s, he got the plastics account. And so you can see the way in which he can just use what he's learned and apply it across these very distinct industries who may or may not have been talking much to one another. So I think the PR firms really made the playbook a global thing, and they took the friction out of the sharing tactics. They are the arms dealers. PR firms provide the weapons for the companies. So in addition to the two sides idea, Hill and Knowlton, they were pioneering in attacking independent scientific researchers. So when the 8 tobacco executives meet in the Plaza Hotel in 1953, they agree that they are under no circumstances, it's underlined in their document, going to attack the integrity of the scientific researchers who have been leading the attack against cigarette smoking. They like war language. The next year, a Hill and Knowlton economist laid out the options for handling the scientists who were making these claims. And the very first option on the list was smearing and belittling them. Today, attacking the integrity of scientific researchers is tried and trusted, and some firms even consider it a specialty. So you mentioned, these product defense firms, and there's a great case of Syngenta using one to hire a biologist, Tyrone Hayes, at UC Berkeley. And when he goes against EcoRisk was the name of the firm, and publishes his result anyway, the company tries to disparage his reputation. They investigate his wife. They harass him both privately and publicly. And Professor Hayes is famous now because he refuses to sell out. The thing is, most people do sell out who work for industry. They don't go against the grain. They continue to quietly publish the results or postpone publishing the results that the industry, as the industry would like. And that's great news for the companies and PR firms who are trying to create scientific controversy. Thanks to the work of Professors Oreskes and Conway, we know about the merchants of doubt in the 20th century, a handful of fiercely anti-communist scientists who created scientific controversy across so many different issues. And I really thought they were able to scale doubt in an interesting way, from issues like acid rain, ozone hole, the hole in the ozone layer, and climate change. But today, what I'm seeing anyway is that the merchants of doubt tend to stay much more in their industry's lane, and they don't work as much across industries, but they happily work outside their area of expertise. This is common. And they seem to be motivated primarily by money, more so than ideology, and the amount of it and the ease of securing it, as well as the amplification the industry can provide. So they are, again, tasked in the way that you described, that for looking for alternative causation or questioning the studies. And they don't do it in a peer-reviewed way at all. They can just tweet about it and get huge industry grants. So that brings me to Frank Mitloehner, who's a professor now at the University of California, Davis, and he works with the meat industry, and who Viveka Morris and I are looking into pretty closely. He got a little bit of funding, $26,000 from the Beef Checkoff program after this 2006 report comes out of the United Nations called Livestock's Long Shadow. And this is a report that tries to quantify and estimate the global impacts of livestock on the environment, including greenhouse gases and climate change. And he gets this grant to challenge the report, especially the idea that the livestock emissions are equivalent to transportation. And he winds up publishing a paper in a journal that does exactly that. It challenges those transportation numbers. But then that year, that was 3 years later, in 2009, the University of California, Davis releases a press release, and it's titled, "Don't Blame Cows for Climate Change." And in the press release, Frank Mitloehner makes statements that are in no way in the published paper. He says things like, "We can certainly reduce our greenhouse gas production, but not by consuming less meat and milk. And producing less meat and milk will only mean more hunger in poor countries." Again, these topics and statements are nowhere to be found in the actual paper. And the media covered this work. A researcher, Vasily Stanescu, has written about the astonishing amount of coverage that press release got. And it basically launches Frank Mitloehner as a climate guy. And he starts getting a lot of industry money after this point, even though he has a PhD, by the way, in animal sciences, worked as an extension officer, and is basically an arm of the meat and dairy industry. He now tweets under the handle Greenhouse Gas Guru, and he spends an enormous amount of effort communicating that cows are not the problem. He loves to keep the attention on fossil fuels. And he runs this giant center at UC Davis called CLEAR, which is completely aimed at muddying the waters on the role of meat and dairy in climate change. It's also a model for other centers like AgNext that is being built at Colorado State University. So on that note, finally, I'd just like to bring up the role of press releases, because I'd be remiss if I did not mention the media as an enabler of industry. We know about the two sides idea. I don't want to belabor that point, but I want to talk a little briefly about this neat study that Rachel Wetz did that got me really depressed. So we know reporters are very busy. They have to file stories quickly. They can't always, go out and do original research. And so sometimes they quote extensively or even verbatim from press releases. So she examined 1,700 press releases from that were all about climate change, and they were from various agencies, including industry as well as NGOs and others. And what's really depressing is that the industry press releases were twice as likely to be reported verbatim compared to the other kinds of institutions. So this suggests not only that press releases are so important, as we know, but that there is actually an allegiance, right, between the media and the industry. Because if it was just reporter laziness, we'd expect to see verbatim articles across all the kinds of different kinds of press releases. So the fossil fuel industry has a number of allies in the media, but not here in this room, of course. So thank you, Amy, for the work that you do, and we look forward to talking.
Hi, I'm Jessica Wentz. I'm a senior fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University, and I'll be providing some legal perspective on accountability for the deception industry, drawing largely on my work with climate litigation. So climate change is often framed as a collective action problem, and this is in fact one of the rhetorical tools that fossil fuel companies are now using to try to disclaim responsibility for the problem. And it can have a significant effect on how we conceptualize legal responsibility for greenhouse gas mitigation and for climate damages. And for many years, the focus has been on government obligations. This is reflected in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as policies and litigation strategies. And there's certainly some truth to this. As Jennifer pointed out, bullshit can have a truthful element. I mean, climate change is a collective action problem, and we do need governments to step up and do their part, but it's not the whole truth. The reality is that there are these individuals and corporations that have intentionally exacerbated the climate crisis. In some cases, you might even say they manufactured the crisis, all for primarily financial profit, in some cases, ideological reasons. And one of their primary strategies, as we've heard today, has been to spread disinformation about climate change. And it's not just fossil fuel companies. There's an entire enabling network of, as we've heard, PR firms, consulting firms, trade associations, even the media and politicians. And this sort of behavior is so clearly unethical and socially harmful. And so there is a compelling need for some sort of mechanisms by which we can establish accountability for public deception. Litigation is one possible pathway through which we may be able to establish that accountability. And there has recently been significant growth in lawsuits aimed at holding fossil fuel companies, as well as some other types of industry actors, accountable for not just the manufacture and sale of fossil fuels or for activities that generate emissions directly, but also for deceiving the public about the harms of climate change. Some of the fossil fuel lawsuits also notably include API as a defendant. And so there is, to some extent, litigation aimed at getting at least one of these enablers. So the litigants are experimenting with different legal theories. Here in the US, we have state and municipal governments that are using tort law and consumer protection law, trying to establish liability on the part of fossil fuel companies for their deception, and they are drawing on the strategies used in litigation involving disinformation about tobacco, which has also recently been adapted to cases involving other types of harmful products and disinformation, including opioids and lead paint. And outside of the US, we have some human rights lawsuits that are proceeding. And there are also some cases that involve more discrete questions about corporate disclosures and fiduciary obligations to discrete groups such as shareholders and investors. So some of the legal approaches that are being tested in these cases are still, as I mentioned, this is somewhat experimentative. We don't know exactly whether and how these cases are going to proceed, but this experimentation is part of how legal systems and legal norms develop. And if and when the climate cases do make it to trial, and if we receive final verdicts from the courts, this could help shape emerging legal norms about this idea of legal obligations to not deceive the public. So there are a number of factual and legal hurdles that the plaintiffs are going to have to overcome in these cases. I think they're actually in pretty good shape when it comes to proving sort of their core argument that major fossil fuel companies like Exxon intentionally deceive the public about climate change, and that is due to the efforts of journalists and social scientists, historians, researchers, all kinds of people who have been working so hard in this space. We now have this very compelling narrative of how these companies conducted their own research on climate change, knew about the risks of climate change, and then intentionally deceived the public. And they also spread disinformation not only about climate science, but about the efficacy and cost of climate policies. And more recently, their main strategy has been, as we've heard, greenwashing their products and activities. At this point, the evidence is so strong, at least against certain defendants like Exxon, that it's hard to imagine how a reasonable fact finder could reach any conclusion other than that these companies intentionally deceived the public about the facts of climate change in order to delay climate action. That being said, I don't mean to imply that there's not room for further research on the question of this conduct in these disinformation campaigns. To the contrary, for one thing, additional evidence is only going to make the plaintiff's claims stronger. There's also a lot of different defendants that are named in these cases, other fossil fuel companies, as well as I mentioned API, and further research on their conduct could be useful. And then there's also room for additional research on the sort of larger network of actors involved in climate disinformation, not to mention other public deception schemes like those related to COVID and the election. So in particular, it would be great to be able to take a deeper dive into how certain groups, public relation firms, and consulting firms have specifically contributed to the messaging of fossil fuel companies. And there is a recent development legally which indicates that this could possibly pave the way for litigation. So there were a number of state attorney generals that filed lawsuits against opioid manufacturers for disinformation about opioids. And they also filed lawsuits against McKinsey, who had provided quite integral sort of support to help flesh out the advertising campaign for opioids, including support, for example, directing companies to focus their messaging on how they can get higher dosages, people taking higher dosages because that's more lucrative for them. And so there was never a final trial and verdict in that case, but McKinsey did end up entering into a settlement with 49 state attorney generals where it agreed to pay nearly $600 billion in damages for its role as an enabler in the opioid crisis. So that's just one example. Even if this sort of research doesn't result in litigation or successful litigation, it would still be useful to have a better sense of the full network of actors involved in climate disinformation. And then I want to conclude with just a couple of other big picture thoughts about the role of disinformation researchers in supporting potentially litigation. So one thing which Professor Oreskes mentioned is in these cases, in addition to proving the fact of conduct, the plaintiffs may also need to present evidence on the effects of disinformation. And so, for example, evidence indicating that deceptive advertising caused people to continue using or increase their use of fossil fuels above and beyond what would have happened in some counterfactual universe where the disinformation hadn't occurred. So that's certainly one area where disinformation researchers could play a big role in sort of fleshing out the factual foundation for the litigation. And then, we talk a lot about corporate accountability. But one thing I think Jennifer did a great job highlighting in her talk is that there are individuals ultimately making all of these decisions. And so I think that there could be a real benefit to more strategic thinking about how we might hold individuals accountable for their contributions to climate disinformation, as well as other major social problems that are driven by disinformation. And then last but not least, I just want to highlight several ways that disinformation researchers can get involved in this work. So one way is that you can potentially serve as expert witnesses in cases, providing your expertise, for example, on the topic of how is it that disinformation influences consumers. Really, there are ample opportunities for pulling in your expertise into these cases. Another way to bring your expertise to the table is to participate in amicus briefs. These are briefs that are prepared by people who are situated outside of the litigation. They don't have a direct interest in the litigation, but they can provide their expertise and insights to judges and fact finders to help them resolve factual and legal issues in cases. And then finally, the Union of Concerned Scientists has also launched the Science Hub for litigation, where they are working to connect researchers, social science researchers, physical scientists, and folks who are actually involved in litigation. And so that's another excellent resource. And I don't know, I guess it's not up on the screen, but if you Google the UCS Science Hub for litigation, you should be able to find it. All right, thank you.
With that, I'd like to invite Amy Westervelt back onto the stage.
Thank you guys all for that. That was really, really great. I want to start by asking a question of everyone on the panel. And that is that, to me, what really jumped out when all of you were talking is just that this thing that we've been calling disinformation that, I've started calling information pollution because I feel like it has no boundaries, And what we see in all of your talks is just how much the exact same strategies are used over and over again in every single industry. And that accountability, unfortunately, does seem to have boundaries. So I'm curious what you think about that. Like, how do we get at this thing that just seems to keep spreading its tentacles into everything when the sort of structures we have only allow us to go after one company or one industry or one person at a time? Just that. Solve it. Just kidding.
I mean, it is a huge problem. One of the reasons I mentioned that there's experimentation with the litigation is because for the most part, we don't have clear causes of action for this concept of sort of fraud that applies to the entire public. And it's somewhat counterintuitive that, all right, you have a cause of action if someone like defrauds a particular individual, causes them economic injury, all right. But then this massive scale of fraud that is so much more harmful than your typical case of fraud, you can't quite litigate it under your typical common law fraud scheme because the legal elements have all been structured with something else in mind. And so perhaps the litigation will help expand some of these legal norms. Certainly outside of the US where they have human rights law available to them, I think human rights law can actually provide sort of a more expansive and malleable legal framework for developing new corporate obligations, which could include obligations not to lie to the public.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll take on the issue of scientific studies. We've known for many years of something called the funding effect, which is the results of studies are very much consistent with the needs of the funders. And that's really across the board. And it's seen tremendously in tobacco, but also more recently in lots of different food products and in e-cigarettes. If you look at the studies done on e-cigarettes, if it was paid for by one of the e-cigarette companies, it tends to say there's no harm. And these aren't done by these very mercenary scientists, the ones I talked about, but actually academic scientists, because there are lots of reasons. When you get funding, you have some interest in making sure your funder is happy, and that's certainly true in the private sector. So I think to build the scientific evidentiary base that we need to protect the public, we need to have systems where polluters and manufacturers of dangerous chemicals, and certainly the fossil fuel industry, pays for the science, but they don't control it in any way. And so you need to set up structures where the money goes into a structure that then chooses scientists who are independent, who are not conflicted to do the studies, because we need those studies to be done, and we need those companies to pay for the studies.
Shout out to Princeton for just yesterday or today, taking a first step towards getting at least some of the fossil fuel funding out of their research. And also this speaks to why that's important. Sorry, did one of you guys want to talk about this whole, how do we get our arms around it?
Well, I'll just add to what David is saying about the contractual agreements between universities and companies, because just solving the fossil fuel alone, as you can see, it won't address the playbook writ large. Right. And so I actually think we do need the universities to step up and say, we will not, allow you to withhold 10% until you're satisfied with the results. We will not allow certain contractual agreements to go through our university and use our universities to greenwash these companies.
I was also going to, actually, one random thought is on the way in this morning, a friend shared with me that in London today, there was an event where they were trying to reposition disinformation as brain pollution, which I think is quite an interesting way to look at it. Because in a way, it's not the pollution of just the atmosphere around us, it's of our own minds. But the other thing I was going to say was maybe at a slightly more meta level is, the very reason that these issues pervade so many industries, so many sectors, is because of the cross-pollination of tactics, by way of the mercenaries, the PR firms, the ad agencies that move between them. Mm-hmm. And so I think that in equal measure, we need the methods we develop and, in broader terms, the strategies we take, the approaches we take, to themselves cross-pollinate, which means collaborating like we're doing here with scholars across industries, and also translating our methods. And one thing that's really emerged, I think, through our meeting is that we need to get better at developing our techniques and our tools so that we can use them more effectively across all these areas.
Yeah. David, I want to ask you a particular question about the product defense scientists. I'm just curious, where do these firms find these scientists? How do they recruit scientists? We kind of, despite all of the erosion of credibility, I think it's just like socially we think of scientists as being, trustworthy people. What's happening there?
Well, first, you have to recognize this is a very lucrative pursuit. Yeah. The companies spend a lot of money paying into these firms, and a lot of the senior scientists have been doing it for a long time. The disheartening thing I see is that, for example, we have graduates from my university who look, and they have master's degrees, they're looking for a job, and these companies hire, and they grind people up, and you work there for a few years, but they're certainly available. The challenging question, though, is how do you then, when you're in a company like that and you end up staying, you end up convincing yourself that what you're doing isn't wrong. And that goes back, to tobacco, asbestos, where you had asbestos executives who saw people get asbestosis and still simply said, it doesn't cause asbestosis. Or the tobacco executives who put their right hands up and swore that nicotine there was no evidence, or there was not yet compelling evidence that nicotine was addictive. I mean, I don't think all those people are liars. I think there's some way they convince themselves, because if they don't convince themselves of that, they can't sleep at night. Upton Sinclair famously said, it's difficult to convince a man of something when his salary depends on him not believing it. Mm-hmm. And that's...
One complicating factor right now, too, is when we live in this age of rampant disinformation, it is so easy for people to say something is disinformation. You can almost weaponize the very concept of disinformation to spread additional disinformation.
Right. Fake news.
Yeah. Again, a question for all four of you. Thank you for mentioning the media's role in all of this. I think the media has been a huge enabler of all of this stuff. But I also think that the techniques and strategies of PR have sort of permanently warped the information ecosystem in this way where, so many stories come directly from press releases. I know because I get the same press releases and then I see the stories, So I don't know. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how we deal with that. How do you not just fight back against disinformation, but sort of, to Naomi's point about inoculation earlier, like how does the media play a role in that inoculation? Anyone? Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. I was recently reading an article about this, and I apologize because I have forgotten the author's name, but a woman was proposing, a legal academic was proposing, basically, since the First Amendment makes it a little bit difficult to go after media directly for disinformation, that perhaps there be some sort of professional accreditation requirements where people in the media have to somehow have some sort of training relevant to ascertaining the difference.
It used to be part of getting the job, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, so that could be one possibility. I'm not sure how effective it would actually be, but it's a thought.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this won't be anything revelatory, but the platforms have to be seen as publishers too, clearly, in this age of disinformation. And there's no way, right? I mean, we've already creeped toward that a little bit, and they keep pushing back, but there's just no way to sort of maintain as is under the current flux of information.
Another thought is, and I'd like to give a special shout out to native native advertising. So basically the direct digital descendants of the advertorials that Naomi and I have studied. The only difference being that now the companies just get to pay the newspaper's own brand studios to make the ads for them.
Shout out to the New York Times.
Shout out to the New York Times. Shout out to Washington Post. Shout out to Politico and a whole bunch of other places.
NPR too, yeah.
They're not special. They all do it, or a lot of them do it.
Yeah.
But it makes me think, because I've met journalists, including in those places, who are very frustrated, especially when they work on climate and environment, that their own newspapers are undermining their reporting. And I have on reasonably good authority that sometimes these companies have the ability to decide when and where these ads run in terms of adjacency to relevant stories and policy and so on.
Yeah, the Washington Post told me that.
Right.
I asked to buy an ad for something, and I asked, like, what kind of keywords can I attach to, and what kind of, and like, they just were like, anything you want. So yes.
So that gets me, that makes me think that myself, being in academia and being part of, I'd say, a generation of scholars who's kind of fed up with what Ben Franch and I call the colonization of academia, this massive amounts of fossil fuel money influencing climate and energy relevant research. There is a groundswell of opposition, of activism amongst scholars internally, making a fuss, saying we're not happy with this. The same thing could happen amongst journalists. If enough of them speak up internally, perhaps I'm naive, I've never been a journalist, but I would be excited to see that. Or perhaps simply to report on it as a legitimate climate story going on in-house or in the houses of their fellow news outlets. I don't know, just the thought.
And if I can just add, one of the conditions that plagues a lot of the media is both-siderism. People say, climate change is real, and it used to be that they'd find one of the few scientists paid for by the industry say, no, it's not real, or the evidence is there. We're sort of past that. In most legitimate venues, you no longer get both sides of that. But you still get that on, is it carbon sequestration and lots of other things. They're more complicated arguments. And so it's important, I think, to engage reporters and point out to them that these arguments are being made the same way, and there really aren't two sides to this discussion either, and to push back on those, because the instinct of most reporters is to say, well, I've got to cover all sides of that story.
Mm-hmm. And just one final note, there's a philosopher, Thomas Kuhn, a philosopher of science, who said that there are very special social conditions to support science. It may not go on forever. And I think that's also true of a press, of a true freedom of the press and a genuine press that's pushing back against power. There's not always the social conditions to support a true press.
Yeah.
May I add the 1 second footnote that New York Times, Washington Post, elsewhere, their climate teams are brilliant. And,
yeah.
I want to make that very clear.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm annoyed on their behalf at what their papers are doing. Yeah.
I imagine they're annoyed too.
Yeah, they are. Okay, so Jennifer, you talked about how these strategies have been around for a really long time, and they've crossed industries, and especially about the press release. And it got me thinking about just how old a lot of the messaging is, and how much it just keeps being repeated over and over and over again across multiple industries, and why that continues to work. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Like, why is it still working? These are, the press release is like over 100 years old. And some of the first ones were printed in their entirety, so the fact that we're back to passages being lifted from press releases is kind of depressing. Yeah.
My thought, it reminded me of junior year of high school where I learned about logical fallacies. And if you're on a debate team or you went through high school, you remember learning all of those. Those are ad hominem, post hoc ergo propter hoc. It's like these are skill sets, developed over a long time on tools for debate. And now they have been corporatized. And I really think this is sort of part of the toolkit that everyone sort of needs to survive in a free market fundamentalism America.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything, David?
I think about some of these same people who are able to sort of say the same things over and over again, and the same scientists who said that PFAS isn't dangerous, or there's no asbestos in talc, or and I can just give you the long list. And what's interesting is, as they can often say at a time there's still some ability to raise doubt, but then it passes. So some of these same scientists who I put up here in the 1990s were working for the tobacco industry, saying that the EPA's risk assessment on environmental tobacco smoke was not, there was inadequate evidence to support that. I think what we need to do is go back and catalog, here are the things they said and the number of times that the science has proven them wrong, and raise the question, why do we even listen to these people? Why are they allowed to pontificate on this? Because clearly what they're doing is lying.
Yeah. That reminded me of something that jumped to mind during your talk too, is that these settlements are enormous in, especially with chemical and health, where you can really prove the link between exposure and a health problem or wrongful death. And yet it keeps fucking happening. It's just it doesn't seem to stop them from continuing to do it. So what would?
Well, regulation. The answer is regulation.
If hundreds of billions of dollars settlements don't do it, then what will?
Government's truly committing to phasing out fossil fuels altogether.
Yeah. We have to, essentially, the government has to step in, as you heard from Naomi's talk earlier. The market is not going to solve these problems. And when you have these big settlements, eventually maybe that will take some money out of the worst offenders' pockets. But often, first, they're covered by the insurance industry anyway. So they're less worried. But it's also too late after people have died, after property's been destroyed. Lawsuits aren't the answer. Lawsuits are useful in terms of encouraging better behavior. But we can't wait for these lawsuits. Not to say we should stop working on them, but we need the government to step in and simply say, this is what you're allowed to do, this is what you're not allowed to do. And that's the only way that we'll really be able to save the world.
Okay, we have a question that's come in from the interwebs. All industries use deception scripts. What are commonalities and distinctions between the various sectors' scripts?
Do I hold up your book?
That's really interesting, yeah.
So one big thing I've noticed, at least between fossil fuel and meat and dairy, because they're using a very similar playbook, but whereas the fossil fuel industry really wants you to believe in individual responsibility, right? This is your responsibility as someone who turns on the lights and drives a car and flies to wherever. But the meat and dairy companies really don't want to focus on individual responsibility. They want to avoid that narrative. They do everything they can to downplay, like you saw in the quote I read, right? Consumers changing their preferences will not matter. And that's a very big distinction, and I think it has to do, obviously, with the fact that we eat 3 times a day, and these choices are much more elastic. And so that strikes me as a major difference.
That's so interesting, yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in on that, on the differences or similarities? Okay, I have another question. It's really analog, old school here. Huh? Okay, from Tim Cook Hurl. He says, in the UK, Client Earth's December 2019 complaint against BP under the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises targeted BP's greenwashing ads. The complaint contributed to BP's decision in February 2020 to withdraw and not replace their global green adverts, and to undertake not to engage in corporate reputation advertising, although they absolutely have done that since then. How can soft law tactics be used against other firms and sectors? I'm not sure what soft law means, but maybe you know. This is an English question, I think.
Just kidding. I'm definitely not responsible for everything said in English. I'm not sure what soft law means, although one can infer, but I was immediately thinking that, there's obviously a very... And also to the discussion about the clearly central, maybe ultimately vital role of government in ultimately precluding this stuff. I wanted also, because I'm aware that there are we are also citizens, and there are many people watching this online, hopefully, and I think it's important to think about how we can nonetheless play a role in combating some of this. And the first thing that comes to mind is the journalist Mary Hegler and the green trolling that she has pioneered on social media. Social media, for all its problems, really a vessel for greenwashing, also provides a small amount of democratization in the sense that it provides individual citizens to punch back. And so her, use of satire and comedy, another climate comedian, Roddy Williams, I want to give a shout out to them because they're really helping to change the public narrative, at least in some constituencies, to just call this stuff out, just call it what it is, the BS that it is. That's one immediate thought.
Yeah.
I suspect by soft law, that person may be referring to sort of the threat of litigation, the prospect of litigation. And the reality is a lot of it's not quite legal precedent, but a lot of the cases that are analogous have been settled rather than gone to trial and received a verdict. And that does suggest that simply the prospect of litigation can change outcomes. And in fact, the McKinsey settlement that I mentioned earlier, I found myself wondering if perhaps, consulting companies and PR firms might actually be more likely to try to settle and improve their reputation in the face of prospective litigation due to the nature of their work, right? I mean, McKinsey isn't completely dependent on, it does do oil and gas consulting, but that's not all it does. It doesn't just do opioid consulting. It's got a broader network of things it does, and it has an interest in maintaining its reputation. So the threat of litigation might be almost more effective with some of these enablers.
Yeah.
I interpret soft law differently, which is sort of interesting. I thought this is more sort of the behavioral economics and looking at some of the enablers of what they can say and not say, but not going directly at fossil fuel production and combustion, which is the problem. And so while I think that's all useful, we are facing this existential threat. And to say, well, we're going to try to, do these, smaller steps, yes, we should do them, but as you heard from Naomi Oreskes, government action really does drive behavior in a way that no one else does. I mean, the story from the OSHA world, which I think sort of captures this, is there's a plastic vinyl chloride. You've all heard of it. Vinyl is used for roofing materials and records and shower curtains. And in the early 1970s, there were 5 cases of a very rare cancer at a vinyl chloride manufacturing facility in Kentucky. So there was no question that vinyl chloride, actually the monomer, the precursor chemical to polyvinyl chloride, caused this fatal and rare liver cancer. And OSHA moved quickly, because they could in those days, to issue a regulation limiting exposure, tried to get to 0, but to 1 part per million. And the industry said what the industry always says: it's unnecessary, it's infeasible, and it will cost, in this case, they said 2 million jobs, because that's the number of people involved in plastic. And it was in the New York Times. It was, that was their message. And OSHA said, sorry, the law is very clear. The law was very new. It said, we need to make sure these workers are safe. They put through this rule. And less than a year later, the headline in Chemical Week was PVC, polyvinyl chloride, goes from jeopardy to jubilation, because the old system allowed the feedstock, which was petroleum-based, into the air. That's why people were exposed. And they were losing a lot of feedstock. And regulation is the mother of necessity in this case. And they enclosed the engineers who were very, they were, I don't even know if they were brilliant, but they figured out pretty quickly how to make this product safely. And they eliminated the exposure, and not a single job was lost. In fact, profitability went up. But we're always going to get this line, well, don't really come right at the target because it's going to cost too much, it's not feasible, it's going to kill jobs. And that turns out more often than not to be the case.
I was also going to say the US congressional investigations going on right now into greenwashing and the history of disinformation, those obviously likely are playing a vital role in renormalizing this landscape the same way they did in the case of the tobacco industry.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add? Okay. I have a question, and then I have another viewer question. Do you think that given how much a sort of side effect of this has been the erosion of credibility for science and expertise in general, do you have any sense that was part of the goal, that's not actually an accidental side effect at all?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought about that. I just assumed that was a byproduct because it's hard to me to think that people are so evil. But we see the skepticism around science around COVID now, which is killing people. I mean, it's a remarkable and disheartening thing. It's hard for me to believe that was intentional. That I think they thought that there's an immediate need, which is to make sure those scientists aren't believed. But
it doesn't stay contained. That's
the Lily Tomlin famously said, "No matter how cynical I get, I can't keep up." And it's
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't think of. I'm thinking through the documents that we're all familiar with.
Reviewing in your head.
I think I've also seen it as a sort of byproduct of a broader, attempt to undermine, to promote a sense of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So you have to promote uncertainty associated with this set of scientists. There's also the opposite, which API, the American Petroleum Institute, was internally explicit about, which was to win over small groups of sympathetic scientists. So that's the flip side of it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'll add something. I mean, it's very unfashionable these days to be passionate about science, but it's really such a cool way of knowing something about the world. I mean, there's no system that can beat it. And
shout out to the scientific method.
When you see in the same document where they suggest, Hill and Knowlton suggests smear and belittle the scientists, they also suggest as the fourth option to raise the issue so far above them that they can't really comment. And to me, that's maybe the closest that I've seen, and maybe you have other ideas of sort of getting at, we're bigger than science, which to me is almost kind of sacrilegious. And that they're not sort of saying we want science to go away explicitly, but they're suggesting that they're so powerful that they can control what we know about the world.
That's so interesting and scary. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Question from Enrique Rosero. He says, talking about personal responsibility, since big settlements don't seem to modify behavior, wouldn't personal liability, holding executives individually responsible, be a way to make them take ownership for greenwashing and pollution?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of why I mentioned this idea of more strategic thinking about accountability for individuals. And to be totally transparent, I have not yet had the opportunity as a legal analyst to really dig into that issue. Even if it's not something that feeds into litigation, though, I think there's incredible value to not just calling out Shell, Exxon, Chevron, but actually calling out people. I remember looking at some of the stuff that's come out of the current congressional hearings, and it's the individuals who are saying things, and you're not just mad at some abstract company. It is people on the ground making these decisions. And so I do think that we need to start trying to call them out more. Yeah. So.
I think something that moves in that direction is a legislative concept that is in place in Australia and New Zealand and other places, which is that corporations have the duty of care. Here we have many different laws. For example, the OSHA law says you have to care for your employees, but it doesn't say anything about a contractor who walks in, or a messenger or something like that, or the pedestrian. It's covered a different way. So the law in Australia is that you have to take care not to do bad things that hurt other people, directly or indirectly. And there's also criminal penalties against corporate board members. Now, I don't know if that's been applied in the climate change. I suspect it hasn't because of, there still is the whole question of attribution that has to get there. But it's a big step forward. And that's certainly something that we should be looking at here. Basically, if you run a business, that business should not hurt someone, right? And that seems like a basic principle that isn't too hard to get to.
Lee Raymond is still alive, right? I mean, this is what is remarkable to me, because somebody is such a mastermind behind so much of this, who ran Exxon for so long, who really made some very important chess moves, is here.
Yeah.
He's next door. I was gonna point out that the CEO of ExxonMobil, Darren Woods, he lied to Congress. When was it? A few months ago. We were watching, and yeah, likewise, these other CEOs are on record disinforming the public, disinforming decision makers. I'm under the vague impression that there is some work going on to try to get at this in a legal sense, but I'm blanking on what that is. So,
yeah, criminal charges. Okay, question from Tobias Bampati. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. If there is one thing we know about climate disinformation, it's that it constantly evolves. What do you think is going to be the main deception tactic in 2, 5, 10 years from now so we can pre-bunk it?
Good question.
Yeah. Who needs to go first?
And maybe we should ask the audience, too. There are a lot of smart people in this room.
That's true. Go. Yes, Carol. Here, introduce yourself, too, for people listening.
It's happening right now, and it's accelerating. And the main deception, and you heard people talking about it, is representing the sources of the problem as the key to the solution. We're seeing it in the rise in narratives around false solutions like net zero, carbon capture and storage, blue hydrogen, blue ammonia. That's where this denial fight is going right now.
That was Carol Muffett from the Center for International Environmental Law, just for people that are listening and not watching. Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in?
Well, I mentioned when I was thinking about beef and dairy that beef is sort of the equivalent to coal. We saw clean coal, then I thought we'd see clean beef. But there's actually there's an analogous case of beef that's now available. And watch for it in a greenwashing ad near you.
Clean beef? Really?
Basically equivalent of that, yeah.
Wow. Anyone in the audience? Panning? No? Okay. Jeffrey? Have you thought about it long enough?
So like some of the recent work that Naomi and I have done has tried to find close rhetorical parallels between the tobacco and fossil fuel industries. One, it's very specific, but one thing that we picked up on is the use of risk rhetoric. So essentially now, and I think we saw it really emerging during those congressional hearings last year, is that now the companies generally state on their websites and in their statements that they acknowledge that the risk of climate change is real, or that the climate change is a risk. And this is drawing from a legal strategy employed really profusely in the case of tobacco defense to shift the blame by basically implying that consumers were aware of the risk and they bought into it. And therefore, the companies themselves aren't liable for it. That's very specific, and to some extent, I hesitate to mention it because it is actually happening right now. Right. But I think we really foresee that trajectory emerging. But it is a really interesting question to think about: are there ways to use, for example, modern algorithmic computational techniques to maybe try to project in ways that we haven't been able to in the past? So that's very thought-provoking, which is an academic way of saying I don't know any answer.
One other possibility is, so as we get more and more detection and attribution research showing us how things are already changing due to climate change, in the past, they attacked sort of more of the general scientific evidence about greenhouse gas emissions causing global climate change. But I could envision, not that I want to give anyone ideas here, but I could envision envision people funding research which is specifically aimed at challenging detection attribution findings, making the claim that, oh, no, it was natural variation that caused this according to our findings. Like, I think that sort of science denial is quite possible for our future.
The way they funded studies of like the other causes of lung cancer and things like that. Yeah.
I do think that, and sorry, this is getting a bit broader, but I do think that attacking the public health science and how it attributes damages is an area. We actually, I know that Exxon's been funding malaria research, I think at Oxford, I want to say, or maybe Cambridge for a long time, and it's obvious why, because it will get worse because of global warming. But I think that could be an area where we see emerging tentacles, going into academic research.
It's interesting to look back on the Exxon Valdez disaster in Prince William Sound, where there was disastrous oil spill killing tremendous amount of sea wildlife. Exxon funded a bunch of studies looking at willingness to pay and trying to essentially shave off some of the liability costs that were used, and these were all used in court, and they very well-known academics, including some here at this prestigious institution, took their money and did these studies that could say, well, it wasn't really worth that much money, in terms of killing all these birds and otters, et cetera.
Wow.
Well, exactly. How much would you pay for the bird? And so I think in the long run, we may see that sort of studies stick its ugly head up as well.
Wow. Okay, I have another question from a viewer. It's hard to imagine, this is Grace Poudrier. It's hard to imagine the state being able to regulate disinformation effectively when the federal government is itself a huge polluter. Yes, Department of Defense, et cetera. Its own agencies suffer from revolving door hires, polluters become regulators, and vice versa. How do you think about regulatory capture in state agencies and federal agencies for that matter? Does that play a role in curbing disinformation?
Excuse me, I'm going to have to say goodbye to
We'll miss you. Thank you so much.
Just applause for...
So that's such a good question. And as we saw during the Trump administration, sometimes the government can be the purveyor of climate disinformation. So one of the reasons that people are concerned about, so one of the First Amendment rationales for not having the government decide what is true and false is concern about having that decision-making authority situated within a centralized government that can, you have a change in administration, suddenly you have President Trump being the guy who decides what's true and false. You don't want that. So that's actually, in my mind, possibly a rationale for why litigation is a perhaps good strategy for dealing with issues of disinformation, because rather than having a centralized government agency that says this is true and this is false, you have a more decentralized system of adjudicating disputes. And the focus could be on massive public deception schemes like what we've seen with tobacco and climate change. You have ostensibly neutral fact finders looking at information after the fact, not sort of making advanced decisions about what's true and false. And so a lot of the First Amendment concerns about having the government arbitrating truth and falsehoods are, I think, less compelling as a reason to not have this happening in the courts. So maybe we could try to get at this through litigation for that reason.
I was hoping that our esteemed senior former government employee would have some thoughts, but apparently he didn't like the question. I don't have much to add, but your addition that it's not just state agencies, but also the federal government writ large. I mean, it's obvious that the hearings we were talking about, the House investigations, I think who knows where politics is going to take us soon, and so I think there are pressures in that regard to get their work done, on these cases. But that's just a quick thought. I think there are other people in this room probably more qualified to answer that.
Does anyone else in the room want to speak to that? Yeah. Can I just have you introduce yourself?
Brad Campbell from the Conservation Law Foundation. There is a revolving door problem in terms of agency capture. And it's not just the Trump administration. One of the most senior climate officials in the Obama White House went directly to the board of one of the biggest fracking companies right after the administration. PFAS was mentioned earlier. When I'm a former regulator, when we were considering regulating PFAS at the state level, a former deputy administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency accompanied DuPont to tell us that, give us all the reasons why we shouldn't regulate PFAS, including things that I could Google and look up and were patently false. So I do think that's a component of the problem in terms of how, when they go back into government, as they often do, how willing they are to actually take on very powerful companies whether consciously or not, they may be seeking employment there or in the enabler industry after their public service.
Okay, that's the end of our time, guys. I really appreciate all of you and your work and all of you in this room and everyone watching and listening. Yeah, this is great. That's it for this time. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back here next week. Drilled is an original Critical Frequency production. The show was created and reported by me, Amy Westervelt. Original music and mixing and mastering for this episode by Peter Duff. Our artwork is by Matthew Fleming. You can find us online at drilledpodcast.com. You can also find us on Twitter at WeAreDrilled. For ad-free episodes and bonus content, you can sign up for our newsletter at drilledpodcast.com or our Patreon at patreon.com/drilled.